If you do need to pop in or out, don't worry. You won't miss anything, and we'll make sure that the recording is sent on to you later, so you don't need to be taking frantic notes. As we were saying, this topic, given how massive it is, seems to get tackled quite rarely. And it's undoubted that climate change is probably the biggest issue of the age, economically, politically, environmentally. And as a result of that, of course, legally, it is regularly cited as a preeminent concern by business when they're surveyed. And one of the key concerns they have is lack of knowledge of the detail, and a lack of knowledge, of course, of where governments are going with it. In particular, look at the issues we had recently when the Labour Party dramatically changed its policies in relation to its green plans. Now, climate change is core, change of government or not, to UK industrial strategy, and not just the UK, of course, it's core globally. We just have to look at the US Inflation Reduction Act, which has led the way, really, recently, with massive subsidies being given by the US government to its domestic green energy groups. In the UK, as you probably know, the climate change path is underpinned by the Climate Change Act of 2008, so it's been around for quite a while. And that really set the basics. It set the targets, it set the plan, and it set a duty on governments to act. In particular, an overriding duty to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to at least 100% of 1990 levels. That's the sort of fabled net zero. So that's great at a high level, but what does it mean in detail? What's the plan? What do you have to do? And what's the law? Well, I'm going to hand over to James and initially to my colleague, Claire Hines, to take you through the detail on that. Just before we do, there's going to be a lot of information here. If you do have any questions, I think because this is going to be quite information dense, what I suggest you do is either just pop a question into the chat and we'll take a note of that. Or if not, if we've got time at the end, just let us know and we should be able to address it one way or the other. So after that brief introduction to a massive topic, I'm delighted to hand over to Claire Hines from Naptons Commercial Department.
Thanks very much, John, and thanks to everybody joining us this morning. I appreciate it's quite a heavy topic for a Tuesday morning. So without further ado, I'll crack on because there's quite a lot to get through, like John said. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So I won't go into too much detail on what actually climate change is. I'm sure we're all aware, we've all been bombarded over the last number of years. It was global warming was the buzzword when I was at school. But put simply, it's a long-term shift in the Earth's average temperature and weather conditions, and it's our fault. It's been caused by human activity. Next slide, please. So global warming is a global issue, obviously. It's been caused by everybody and needs to be addressed by everybody. So under the 2015 Paris Agreement, the international community came together and set goals to basically put a lid on global warming and ensure that the rise in global mean temperatures is kept well below 2 degrees above the pre-industrial levels, and it aimed to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So we all know that we have to achieve this concept of net zero to meet these targets set out by the Paris Agreement, but there isn't actually one globally recognised definition of net zero. There can be variances in its interpretation, and you need to be clear on what the initial parameter is that we're looking at in pre-industrial times, 1990s, 2010, and what's actually being taken into account when we're trying to determine what we're netting off. Is it just CO2? Is it all emissions, etc.? Broadly, though, a net zero target has come to mean the goal of achieving volumes of greenhouse gases produced from anthropogenic sources, that means us, human activity, and the greenhouse gases removed from the atmosphere, so carbon sinks, oceans, huge forestation, etc. Next slide, please. So what do we need to actually be thinking about when it comes to climate change specifically? Obviously, as human beings, we are impacted, our future generations are impacted, and we have a moral and ethical obligation to address it and to tackle it. But taking it back to the business side of things, what do we as businesses need to be thinking about? What do we need to pop into our strategies to tackle this going forwards? How is it going to affect us? And what do we need to do about it? What can we do about it? And we're very conscious that you as in-house lawyers and managers are likely to be asked to pick up the compliance reins as regards your organisation's compliance with climate change obligations and contractual requirements on the company, for example. And as risk managers, you'll be looking at how climate change is going to impact the bottom line to the extent it hasn't already. So what are those challenges specifically? So I'm going to run through some of the key ones, general ones that will impact and should be looked at by all organisations. So the first one, the obvious big ticket item here, is the physical impact of climate change. We've seen over the last couple of years floods in the northeast of England. We've seen wildfires, Sydney, California. Operational supply chains can be severely impacted by these weather events. So depending on where your sites are located and where those of your key suppliers are located, this could impact you directly. But even before we get to that sort of catastrophic point, we're looking at, well, increased insurance policies. Do you need to take out different insurances? Is there a risk of your assets being valued at a lower value because of where they're sited? So what do you need to do about that? Do you need to relocate altogether? Consider additional insurance, as we noted. Next, moving on to increased costs. So it's maybe harder or more expensive to source certain measures and materials such as energy, water, raw materials. Think about the reduction in, obviously, the scarcity of water if there's an extremely hot summer and droughts globally. But also think about the knock-on effects and costs of compliance as well. So increased reporting obligations, that needs to be carried out by somebody. You might need to implement technology, engage professionals to come and help achieve that. So reporting alone and compliance there is going to be a cost to the business, never mind actually implementing any measures that you subsequently agree to put into place to meet any net zero targets that are set. And other specific compliance costs that may impact you. So for example, building regulations changing. I've had personal experience of this in the last couple of years where we decided to undertake a very simple project, convert a conservatory into a room, pop a roof on, put some walls up, thought it'd be a nice, easy, cost-effective way of getting another room added to the house. But we did a very similar project a couple of years ago, and the costs this time went up massively, not just because of the increased cost of raw materials, but because of the compliance required with the building regulations that require this extra layer of insulation. Buildings now need to be efficient by design. So you can imagine that on a massive scale, if you need to build a new factory, a new warehouse, there's going to be increased costs included there. Cultural impact, the next one. Pressure from all angles, effectively. We're seeing investor pressure, shareholder, employees, and consumers. Increasingly, a consumer will reach for a product that has sustainability badged all over it. And those millennials, so people aged between 18 and 34, sadly, I think most of us on this call fall outside of that bracket, but I'm sure there's a few of you in there, prefer to buy from companies that share their values, especially as regards sustainability. So businesses that don't visibly engage with decarbonisation do risk a damage to reputation and the brand. So when you're thinking about putting your strategy together, you obviously need to include your marketing team or marketing provider to make sure your green credentials are very clearly and lawfully communicated. And an increasing number of companies are voluntarily setting themselves net zero targets. This isn't absolutely mandatory yet in law, but an increasing number of companies are opting to do so. And this essentially results in peer pressure on competitors to do the same, also known as the race to net zero. From an employment perspective, employees are increasingly looking to work for greener companies. So again, any green credentials should be put out there in your recruitment strategy as well. I don't want to be all doom and gloom about the landscape, however. I have personally seen clients putting their existing products and materials into new uses which have a sustainability angle, which is fantastic. So we do hear this trade-off of challenges versus opportunities, but the opportunities genuinely are there. It's obviously about taking a step back and strategizing and seeing how that can work. And likewise, when we talk about increased cost, there is obviously the potential for reduced costs over time once you see the benefits of measures that have been implemented. Can we have the next slide, please? So other measures and circumstances that you need to be thinking about impacted by climate change: new activity. So mergers and acquisitions, joint ventures, taking out new facilities. All of a sudden, if you're looking to acquire a new target company, you should be including into your normal due diligence questionnaires climate considerations in there. Think about the reputational risk of being associated with that target company. Could you resell that company and commercialize it over time? Or is it a carbon intensive organization? Will the market simply move away from it? Likewise, very similarly on the JV, joint venture side of things, or a commercial collaboration, think about who you're getting into bed with. Do you risk a reputational challenge of being associated with that party? Are your positions aligned as regards climate strategy? Have you set goals and made commitments that would be put at risk if you collaborate with this other party? We are seeing more of these sorts of questions included in standard due diligence inquiries. Investment and finance. This is a real key part at the minute when we're thinking about climate change considerations. So climate related investment, so that is investment in climate technologies. So we're thinking about renewable energies and EVs are growing rapidly. And some of the most sophisticated investors in energy, industrials, and infrastructure are turning their attention to these sorts of climate-focused technologies. But outside of the specific climate technologies themselves, there is an increased demand from insurers, lenders, shareholders, and other investors to get the companies to disclose their climate change plans and position so that they can assess properly the financial impact of their investments. They want to know, A, that the company they are investing into has a long-term and a decent forecast and isn't going to be hugely impacted by climate change measures and legislation and situations. And also, there are increasing rising returns on sustainable assets, and ESG and sustainability characteristics are one of a great number of characteristics that funders are looking at when deciding where to place that money. Then moving on to legislation. So as John said, climate change really is set to be the biggest policy and legislative driver that we have seen and will see in our lifetimes. Therefore, there won't just be one or two key pieces of legislation. It will trickle into all areas of law effectively. So take marketing, for example. Legislation does protect against greenwashing in adverts and consumer protection law. And there has already been case law in this area recently. So, for example, innocent smoothies or not so innocent smoothies found to have made false claims about the percentage of their packaging that's actually recycled. So like I say, we couldn't possibly go into any detail on every piece of legislation. So if we just pull out a couple of the key pieces. So we've mentioned the Paris Agreement, and this did see nearly all the world's nations for the first time coming together to support and champion a common strategy to cut greenhouse gases. It was adopted by 194 parties, which is 193 countries plus the EU, so all the countries contained therein, of course, in the French capital in December 2015. All the parties to the Paris Agreement agreed to pursue efforts to limit the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees and to keep them well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial times. And each country has to set its own emission reduction targets, which will be reviewed every 5 years. So it's kind of going bottom up effectively, rather than the Kyoto arrangement, which set targets down to the participants. Paris says to the participants, no, you set your own targets, but they need to be within the overall strategy that we've agreed under the Paris Agreement. So the Climate Change Act 2008, again, John touched on this earlier, does set a legally binding net emissions reduction target for the UK of 100% by 2050. Originally, when drafted, it was 80%, but obviously ambitions had to be raised after the Paris Agreement was entered into. But as we've seen, Rishi Sunak did delay certain crucial green policies, such as the phasing out of fossil fuel cars last year. So I've read all different pieces of information about whether we're meeting targets, whether we're not. I think the general consensus appears to be that we're possibly not on track to meet the 4th and 5th, because it's on 5-yearly cycles. We're possibly not on track to meet those as it stands. So the government has committed itself to meeting these targets under the Paris Agreement, but hasn't directly yet placed those obligations onto us, the businesses, but it's coming in dribs and drabs through legislation in various forms. So if we just have a quick look at the environmental and climate disclosure. So it's a really complicated and vast area, and the disclosure requirements are complex and vary depending on the size and type of business you are, varies as to where you have to include your disclosures. So we won't go into them in any detail. It's very much business specific as to whether you fall into quoted organisation or a large business under the Companies Act 2006, for example. But investors do need to be able to value assets, and climate change does pose a massive risk to the global economy. So clear and high quality information on the impacts of climate change from all organisations is being pushed for and is required. So the ultimate goal, as I see it, is that we are looking, or the government is looking, to standardise the format of the disclosures to be provided by everybody. And that is being looked at, and it's not yet been implemented. There is still a hodgepodge of information and legislation around about the various pieces of information that companies need to provide and where they need to provide it. But the overall goal, as I understand it, is to eventually standardise those requirements. So the listing rules require the commercial companies with a UK premium listing and companies with a standard listing to make comply or explain disclosures. So those familiar with corporate governance rules will have come across comply or explain before, which isn't mandatory, but basically says companies either need to make the disclosures or explain why they've not been made. So it puts a lot of pressure on those to be made. And they need to be aligned with the TCFD recommendations. So for anybody not familiar with that acronym, the TCFD is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and it published its recommendations back in 2017. Next, the Company Strategic Report Climate-Related Financial Disclosure Regs 2022. This provides that publicly quoted companies, large private companies and large LLPs need to make climate-related disclosures financial disclosures in relation to financial years beginning on or after the 6th of April 2022. Now, the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, isn't directly referenced in the legislation, but the information to be provided under that piece of legislation is in line with the 4 key elements or pillars of the TCFD recommendations. Then we have the streamlined energy and carbon reporting, or the SECR requirements under the Companies Directors Report and Limited Liability Partnerships Act. So this essentially, this regime requires those companies within scope to report their tons of carbon dioxide emissions, and different types of entity are subject to slightly different requirements in terms of what they need to disclose. So anyone that's had to go through this process will be familiar with the scopes, scope 1, 2, and 3. Presently, the SECR doesn't require scope 3 emissions to be reported. However, a number of organisations are voluntarily opting to do so. And of course, this has a knock-on effect on their supply chains. And we'll talk now briefly about the different scopes. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so if we can move on to the next slide again. Perfect, thank you. So scope 1 is essentially asking you to report and detail direct greenhouse gas emissions that result from activities owned or controlled by the organisation. So if you think about furnaces, machinery, vehicles, that a fleet of vehicles, for example, are owned by the company, those are direct emissions that would fall under the scope 1 area. If a company outsources some of the manufacture of its products, a portion of it, to a third party, they wouldn't fall under scope 1, they would fall under scope 3 because they are part of the company's supply chain, but they're not provided on equipment that's owned or controlled by that company. So it would fall under scope 3. Likewise, if a company outsources its distribution to a network, then those vehicle emissions would fall outside of scope 1 because they're not directly owned or controlled by that company. Scope 2 is essentially the purchased heat and electricity, and these are to be provided under the requirements of scope 2. So people might say, well, it's electricity, it's not specifically generating emissions from the use of electricity, and we're looking to electrify everything anyway. But of course, at the fundamental base, there will be emissions generated depending on how that electricity has been taken. If it's from a renewable source, obviously, it's much less than from other sources. So scope 3 includes all other emissions that an organisation is indirectly responsible for, all the way down, upstream and downstream of its value chain, essentially. So if you take scope 1 and scope 2 out of it, if you look at taking a product, for example, because it's much neater to discuss, a product from its absolute birth to its absolute death, what emissions are generated in connection with that. So when you look at it that way, the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions actually might only be a tiny part of the footprint of what that organisation actually does, if quite a lot of the intensive emission work is outsourced elsewhere. So only reporting on scope 1 and scope 2 gives potentially quite a narrow view on a company's carbon footprint effectively. And there is a push for much more scope 3 requirements. And I think James is going to talk about some exclusions to where there are some scope 3 requirements to be disclosed within the NHS supply chain. But generally speaking, at the minute, it's voluntary, but moving very much towards becoming a mandatory reporting obligation. If we can have the next slide, please. So you may or may not have set a net zero target for your organisation. there's an awful lot to consider when you're setting your net zero target and thinking about what's it going to cover. Is it going to cover scope 1, 2, 3 emissions? Are you setting short-term meaningful goals, so for 2025, 2030, or one long-term goal with pinch points in the middle where you review and take into account where you've got to? And then, of course, how are you actually going to achieve meeting that goal that you've set yourself? Will it be via actual reductions of greenhouse gas emissions, or are you going to rely more heavily on offsetting? That's obviously compensating for emissions by reducing emissions elsewhere. What capital expenditure is required to put these provisions into place? And have you drawn up and disclosed a transition plan? At the minute, transition plans aren't compulsory, but there is a move under the Green Finance Strategy which commits to consulting on new requirements for the largest companies to publish transition plans. So your transition plan will set out how the company will adapt, how will it manage moving to a low carbon economy. And it's a very important tool, both inward facing for the company to use to determine how it's going to get there and what it's going to put into place, but also to put out there to the public, especially to investors, to show exactly what you're going to do and how you're going to manage it. In terms of legislation, if we consider greenwashing, so the Competition and Markets Authority and the Advertising Standards Authority are tightening their regulation of climate and other environmental claims. There are specific rules on making environmental claims in the CAP code and then the BCAP code, which is the broadcasting equivalent, obviously. And the ASA has confirmed its intention to, in its own words, shine a brighter regulatory spotlight on any adverts that touch on the environment. So the basis of any environmental claims need to be clear. Any unqualified claims could be misleading if they omit significant information. So I'll just pull out a couple of examples of where the ASA has waded in and taken a view on particular adverts that touch on the environment. So Alpro, you'll probably be familiar, they're the plant-based suppliers of milks and yogurts. They promoted their products as good for the planet. The ASA considered the claim could be interpreted in more than one way, and it wasn't properly explained in the advert exactly what was meant by this. So because the basis of the claim was unclear, it was seen to be breaching the CAP code. Innocent, again, have been pulled up by the ASA because they had an advert which encouraged people to reduce, reuse, and recycle. So they're not making any specific environmental claims, but the ASA thought the advert could be implying that purchasing those products was a choice made by consumers that would have a positive environmental impact. Now, Innocent, when asked about this, couldn't actually produce evidence that through the whole life cycle of their drinks, they did have a net positive impact on the environment. So the ASA concluded the advert was misleading and in breach of the CAP code and also the BCAP code, because presumably there must have been some televised adverts with the same promotion as well. Brewdog, I think it's an interesting one. So Brewdog popped an Instagram post out claiming it was the world's first carbon negative brewery. It then had some wording that directed the viewers of the Instagram post to Brewdog's bio. And within the bio, there was a link to explain the basis of that claim. Brewdog said, listen, given the constraints technologically and with the space on an Instagram post, we couldn't put all that detail in the advert itself. However, the ASA said that the carbon negative claim could and was likely to mislead people unless the explanation of the claim was included in the advert itself. And then finally, electric cars. So adverts for electric cars can't claim to have zero emissions without clarifying that this is only whilst they're being driven. Because at other points, for example, during the manufacture of the EVs or while charging them at a national, using a charger from the national grid, emissions are actually generated. So you'll notice that now on EV adverts that any zero emissions claims need to state that this is whilst they are being driven. So if a company is found by the ASA, as all these organisations were, to have breached the CAP code or the BCAP code due to greenwashing in their advertisement, what can the ASA actually do about it? Well, they can't actually levy fines, but what they can do is they publish their findings, which then can be obviously picked up by the press, and that causes, of course, reputational damage. They can demand that the advert's removed, so you've got wasted expenditure there in preparing the advert in the first place, and then obviously having to replace it with something else, or modify it at least. And you can't seek any awards recognition either for any adverts that have been breaching the CAP or BCAP code. In terms of the sustainability disclosure requirements, this has just been introduced very, very recently. So in this case, this is the FCA is concerned about the risk of greenwashing posed by the increase in these sustainable funds available in the market, and whether these claims are always quite as legitimate as they appear to be. So there's various proposals that make up the SDR, but one that applies to all FCA authorised firms says that any claims, any sustainability claims about their products and services need to be fair and clear and not misleading, and they must be consistent with the sustainability characteristics of that product or service. And this anti-greenwashing rule comes into play at the end of May, 31st of May 2024. We could have the next slide, please. So the last thing that I want to talk on specifically is your contracts. And I'm sure any in-house lawyers or contract managers on the call will have come across these sorts of clauses creeping increasingly into your contracts. So many customers are imposing or strengthening their environmental requirements on suppliers. So they may require suppliers to have specific environmental management systems. They may require suppliers to have comply with a code of conduct that has climate-related obligations in it. They may say you have to comply with specific environmental laws and policies and give us warranties as to the same. If you are going to introduce any climate change specific obligations, then this needs to be looked at the very, very early stages or initial negotiations, rather than popping it in a contract if it's to have any meaningful bite to it, if you're looking to impose those on your suppliers. And again, we need to look at what are the targets, are they realistic? Are we very, very clear on what they actually require of both parties? How are we going to measure any success? Is there a standard reporting process that we require from our suppliers? And what do we do if there's non-compliance? If we ask a supplier to commit to a specific target to be set, what if they don't comply? Are we going to terminate the contract? That may be too risky for a supplier. So you may want to consider linking it to KPIs or and then being awarded the service credits, etc. But generally speaking, the use of detailed climate change clauses, like setting net zero targets, we haven't found yet to be commonplace. It's not something we've been coming across day to day in our contracts. However, there is evidence to suggest that there is momentum gaining in this area, and especially amongst the larger corporates and those in the finance sector. So, for example, Vodafone has committed to halving its Scope 3 emissions by 2030, and it wants net zero across its full supply chain or value chain by 2040, so a full 10 years before the government target. So consequently, because we're talking Scope 3 emissions here, we need to be able to look at our supply chain and everybody that's involved in that business. And so they've included 2 clause templates to be rolled out in their supplier contracts, depending on the environmental risk. They've taken those clauses from the Chancery Lane project clauses, which we'll discuss in a second. Likewise, NatWest has introduced sustainability clauses across its template supplier contracts. It requires suppliers to improve their externally assessed sustainability score. So presumably at the outset, as part of onboarding, they're getting their suppliers to be assessed for sustainability, and they then need to improve that score over time. Failure to improve that score can lead to termination of the contract. So obviously, if this is a key contract for any suppliers, it's incredibly important to them to be able to meet those clauses and the sustainability improvements. They were also taken from the Chancery Lane project clauses. Now, I don't know if this is something you're aware of, or perhaps even some of you may have been involved in putting these clauses together. But essentially, the Chancery Lane project was a massive global network of lawyers and business leaders who came together to try to figure out ways to effectively decarbonize contracts. So they've written over 100 climate change clauses with associated glossary terms, and they're freely available to anybody that wants to use them. That's certainly something we'll be looking to do. However, in February this year, the Chancery Lane project did announce that it would be moving more towards best practice guides. So the clauses may therefore not be updated and maintained in accordance with legislation. So it's just worth bearing that in mind if you do take any off and start using them in your templates supply agreements. So that's some of the broad issues that would affect many, if not most, businesses when it comes to climate change. There are, of course, sector-specific and product-specific issues related to climate change that could affect your business that you would look at on an individual level. And actually, just this morning, I read on the BBC News website about the challenges of UK brewers and the issues with the hops struggling with the climate change. Basically, the hops plants don't like these, allegedly, I should say, hot, long, dry summers that we're getting. And there's been a decline in the hops plants being able to be produced. So this is causing, concern amongst the brewing community, of course, and they are now looking to genetically modify hops plants to make them a bit more drought resistant. So for any real ale drinkers out there, they are in safe hands. There should be good continuation of the hops production, but it's just a good example of something that impacts one particular sector, and it's directly climate related as well. So those individual sectors need to look at what might impact you and your business. So I'm going to pass you over to James now, who's going to take you through a bit more technical detail in relation to addressing climate change. Thanks, James.
No, thank you very much, Claire. That was fantastic. I said, they say I've learned more just now than I have in the past couple of weeks actually around this. So thank you very much for that. Hello, everyone. My name's James Valentine. I'm the Senior Technical Engagement Manager for the AMRC Northwest, but also one of the leads on our low carbon smart building demonstrator, as well as rolling out some sustainability projects, road mapping, energy monitoring systems across manufacturing businesses within the Northwest and nationwide to an extent. We, as I suppose, as obvious as it sounds, we're seeing most of the effect of climate change and the associated certifications and necessary changes manufacturers are needing to make. And I'll go through some of them today, as well as what we're doing to help businesses tackle that. I will just mention that the majority of the companies that we work with, whilst being manufacturers, are also not necessarily your OEMs. So when it comes down to the idea of Scope 3 having a negative impact on businesses, but not necessarily being essential, when companies are setting net zero targets, Scope 3 falls under their net zero target. It usually does. And when companies like your aerospace, your large aerospace, your large automotive, your large food manufacturers start considering their Scope 3, that puts a lot of pressure on the supply chain, usually consisting of smaller manufacturers, SME manufacturers that are maybe not quite in the position to start to make the change themselves, and they're looking for any answers that they can find. So I'll go over a couple of examples of that as well. If we want to push through. So who are we doing it for? So this is in relation to a business that's looking at improving their sustainability or increasing their sustainability, tackling climate change themselves. The biggest one, as discussed, is at the top there. It's the customer. So whether you are an OEM manufacturer producing products, your customer is still the one thing that you need to keep in mind when you're discussing sustainability goals and sustainability objectives. As Claire covered very nicely, customers nowadays, myself, I'm fortunate enough to just fall in with that millennial bracket. And I will take into consideration the idea that something is a more sustainable option, even if it is a percentage cost increase over the less sustainable product. But when it comes to manufacturing, introducing sustainability or considering your carbon leakage and your carbon emissions usually comes with increased efficiencies. Less waste means more efficient manufacturing. So that gives you a reduced lead time and it increases your company image tenfold, as well as allows you to kind of keep those contracts in place. And then more looking internally, again, when it comes down to managing directors, shareholders and stakeholders within a business, the biggest one is often company image, but it's making themselves resilient. So making sure the company is supply chain resilient, they have customers and they have suppliers that are looking inwards and almost appreciating the work that's going into becoming more sustainable. And then further down, you've got some internal things. Finance directors, usually more interested in your return on investment. So if we're investing in solar panels, what's my ROI? How effective are they going to be? When are we going to get our money back? And then down to operations directors and engineers, people who are from a cultural level considering this and considering the choices that businesses are making. So me as an engineer, I'm interested in what the AMRC are doing from a sustainability perspective. I'd like to have some kind of say in that and some kind of input. But at the same time, as long as I can see the gears turning and people actually working towards becoming more sustainable, then it keeps me happy as someone who's part of that business. Next slide, please. So customer first thinking. So this was just very briefly mentioned. This is one example of many that we have firsthand experience with businesses not knowing about, just strictly due to they haven't come across it, they haven't seen it, they've missed it, they're too busy, they're not considering sustainability. This is two snippets from the NHS's carbon reduction plan. The first one being, and already in practice, anybody that is supplying new contracts or goods, services into the NHS with a value of above £5 million per year must publish a carbon reduction plan. So they must have scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions defined and a subset of their scope 3 emissions defined and reported. That is a must, and that is already in play. Now, £5 million sounds like a lot of money, but when you're supplying into somebody like the NHS, you very quickly start to fall under this bracket. And if you're not taking this into consideration, you will lose that business, you will lose that customer. However, moving forward from that, for April 2027, all suppliers into the NHS will be required to publicly report their targets. They will have to have something that aligns with the NHS's net zero target for all of their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So if you're a business that is not necessarily considering this, I worked with a business recently that is, they work very closely with opticians, they work very closely with NHS, and they were not aware of this. This is something that they're not aware of, and now we're 3 years away from when they have to have a carbon reduction plan in place, and they have to be publicly reporting their emissions, their greenhouse gases, and other variables in that. So it's becoming essential very quickly to have businesses know about this and have options that isn't just consultancy outwards. We want to bring this kind of stuff internal. Next slide, please. So this is one of the main things that we're considering. So within the industry I work in, obviously you're looking at a lot of import and export of raw material, steels, concrete, ceramics, down to even glass and various other materials. CBAM, or the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is a carbon border tax that was created by the EU in an attempt to combat carbon leakage. So carbon leakage is when a business will import carbon-intensive products such as your steels, your ceramics, your concretes from countries that have less stringent climate policies. And by extension of that, they have less cost associated to that. So the business that's importing them gets a reduced cost to have essentially a less reported or a less stringent reporting process on the climate impact of that material that they are importing. CBAM is a way to combat that. And essentially what it boils down to is if I import my raw material from China into the EU, I will pay obviously my carbon emissions tax on that, but I will now also have to pay the equivalent of if I ordered it from within the EU. So if I order it from China and I'm expecting to pay less on my associated carbon costs, I now pay the same amount. There's no incentive for me to order that from outside of the EU, other than potentially maybe a quicker lead time. But the cost associated will be the same as if I ordered it from the EU inside the EU. And then based on CBAM implementation, it's currently in a transitional phase where companies that are importing carbon intensive production are having to do a series of reporting based on this. But by 2026, this will be a full CBAM implementation, and it'll be fully operational, and all corporations that are importing carbon intensive or CBAM marked materials will have to be reporting every import that they do. The way this is going to work is you will buy carbon credits or CBAM certificates, and you will use those certificates to make up the rest of the cost of your import of your goods from a carbon perspective. For those wondering and those that don't know, the UK also has a UK carbon border adjustment mechanism to start in 2027, and that will shrink this even further. So there will be an increased cost, obviously, associated with the idea of importing goods domestically within the EU. The EU is a big place. The UK CBAM will be, if you order it from outside of the UK, you will be expected to pay the equivalent of if you would have ordered it from within the UK, not just the EU. So this shrinks this even further, and is going to have quite a high impact on cost associated with imports of certain materials and goods. The EU version of this doesn't include glass and ceramics, but the UK version of it will, in an attempt to obviously bolster and boost the UK economy and start to build up those supply chains domestically rather than abroad. So this is a massive consideration for people within manufacturing. They should already be considering this, but there are a lot of businesses that peg a lot of their supply chain abroad and outside of the EU and outside of the UK for reduced cost. That is going to increase, and it's going to be a big hit for companies that aren't really prepared for that. Next slide, please. So aligning your business is typically the first step. So a lot of businesses that we work with will not be aligning their business from a sustainability perspective. Now, it could be as simple as identifying specific sustainable development goals or SDGs, as you can see on the screen. Not all of these are significantly relevant to the manufacturing industry, but most of them are relevant to an industry or a company in some way. And aligning your business to one of these publicly and having this as part of your carbon reduction plan, as well as internally promoting what you are aligning the business to, is a good way to start reducing your scopes 1 and scopes 3. Scope 2 typically falls well within people looking at renewable tariffs and energy generation from renewable sources, or 70% renewable, 30% fossil. And that typically is one of the easier ones to tackle. However, scopes 1 and 3, they're typically more tough. As Claire mentioned, scope 3s make up about 70% of a manufacturer's carbon footprint usually. So they are an absolute Goliath to take care of and start to chip away at. But your low carbon reduction plans and your sustainable goals have a time frame associated with them. It doesn't have to be all here, all now. It can be one bit at a time and start to significantly reduce your overall carbon emissions, and then feed that back out to your customers, your potential suppliers, and be able to produce this data and say, look, we are doing this. Here's our public data on this. Interestingly enough, it's funny you mentioned the BrewDog controversy, I suppose, or controversy. There's a lot of terminology out there nowadays, and this is one point of contention in a lot of businesses. It's you'll walk into a business and they'll say, right, well, there's carbon neutrality, there's carbon positivity, carbon negativity, there's net zero emissions, there's net zero carbon. Where on earth do we start? And obviously the biggest and most obvious differences between these are Carbon neutrality is one of the easier goals to hit. And carbon neutrality means you are offsetting as much carbon that you are putting into the atmosphere. You can look at that from emissions neutrality as well. For a manufacturer, that is typically your early goal. So a lot of companies will set a carbon neutral 2030 goal with a net zero 2050 goal or a net zero 2040 goal. Carbon positivity is you are removing more than you're generating. So you're generating X amount of carbon or emissions, and carbon positivity is the act of removing more than you generate. So you're having a positive effect on the amount of carbon within the atmosphere. Carbon negativity, pretty much the same thing. Net zero is the art of not needing to offset what you're producing because you're not adding anything to the atmosphere. Now, net zero emissions and net zero carbon are two different things. Net zero carbon is specifically around carbon-related emissions, CO2e per kilogram, and net zero emissions is taking into account all of the other greenhouse gas emissions that you may be producing as a business. So it's important for a lot of businesses to clarify that and align their business to a specific goal, knowing what that goal is. Next slide, please. So what can we do now? So this is our aim at helping businesses, essentially. So we developed a 7-step sustainability roadmap with the aim of allowing businesses to kind of take this in themselves and do it internally without consultancy, without having to pay out to a sustainable business, or without having to make any drastic changes to elements within the business. The roadmap is it's defined for manufacturing, but can absolutely be put into any other kind of business with a little bit of tweaking. So you wouldn't want lean manufacturing in a law firm or a barrister's. But the aim of this is to be able to allow businesses to gain a bit of confidence within themselves and say, right, we can actually do this. This is something that we can identify the numbers, we can publish those numbers, and then we can say this is what our aim is. So if we just go over to the next slide, please. I'm just trying to remember in my head where I'm at. Okay, so some simple ways to do that. To go carbon neutral or to go carbon negative or to go carbon positive, you have to know what your carbon footprint is. That is the first thing. It's all about data. So you need to know as a business, what is that number? What is the number that we are trying to reduce? What is the number that we are trying to match? So one sustainability objective or one number that you can generate as a business is comparing your turnover or your profit against the amount or the size of the carbon footprint you left to make that profit. This is something that every business can consider. So generating your carbon footprint against your energy bills is a very high level way of doing that, but you can compare that against the amount of money that you made for that energy bill month as a business. And you can start to change that number. So if you reduce your carbon footprint against the same amount of profit, that number will increase. Whereas if you increase your turnover, so you start charging more for your products, probably the less ethical solution, but if you start charging more for your products and you have the same carbon footprint throughout, that number again will increase. And the higher that number, the better. So it gives businesses a target, it gives businesses a goal. We need to make this number bigger. If we just go over to the next slide, please. Another one of the easiest ones to do, and something we're doing at the AMRC ourselves, and a lot of businesses are considering now. Claire hit the nail on the head with electric cars. You've got the idea between what is called embodied carbon and operational carbon. So the embodied carbon of a home, a modular home that's claiming to be more thermally efficient and more carbon neutral, and the embodied carbon of a vehicle is what the product arrives with you as a backlog. So this product arrives to you and it has a carbon footprint from its manufacturing. The operational carbon, so an electric vehicle may be operationally carbon neutral because when you drive it, you're not emitting, depending on your tariff used to charge it, etc. But considerations for another time. And same for a home. So if you have a home, you have an operational carbon, which is the life cycle of that home, how much carbon emissions or how many greenhouse gas emissions are related to the operation of that home, from electricity usage, gas usage, maintenance, repair, extensions, land value, etc. We're coming into a pretty scary time where, when it comes to the construction industry specifically, our embodied carbon is going to very quickly match our operational carbon. We're getting very good as a country and as a planet at reducing operational carbon by introducing solar panels and various other ways to reduce operational carbon footprint. But we're getting no better at reducing our embodied carbon. So if we're ordering concrete, aluminium, bricks, mortar, etc., from countries that are not taking into consideration the emissions of one, quarrying, mining, refining, and then processing those final products and shipping them over to wherever the home is being built, you're not going to reduce the embodied carbon. So try as you might, you can't make that number any smaller. When it comes to a business, you've got an impact that you can have. So this is a really simple way of doing it, is calculating the greenhouse gas or carbon emissions of your commuting, of your workforce. So this is a number, this is part of your, it's part of your scope 3, whether it's upstream or downstream, I suppose can be argued, but dead easy to do. This is from the greenhouse gas emissions guide. And you can almost, based on one employee per, reduce your carbon emissions by up to 1,300 kilograms of CO2 emissions per year per staff. If you look to implement things like cycle to work schemes, if you look to implement carpooling situations, or you look to have electric vehicles. There's a lot of businesses. I spoke to a business yesterday. They attended a conference, they came back and they went, right, we're selling all of the Land Rovers, we're buying electric vehicles, and we'll have to just deal with it. We'll have to deal with the logistics of it. If we're driving down the country to do what we're doing, we'll deal with it logistically. We'll start to plan more efficiently on our journeys so that we can drop into charging stations and do that. Even that's a very small decision, and it can be a very cost-effective decision depending on mileage and mileage allocations to different vehicles or petrol vehicles. The ROI on it's pretty quick, and it's a target. At the end of the day, if you do this we have 70 staff. If we're looking at reducing 70 staff's carbon footprint on their commute, that's going to be a sizable chunk of CO2e removed from the atmosphere just based on a decision-making process and exercise. So it's a good place to start. Next slide, please. So yes, so we'll get into data. So data is essentially where this starts. Conveniently, there's a huge skills gap in the market at the minute around data analytics and data processing within manufacturing. A lot of people don't associate manufacturing or engineering with data, but it's a misconception. Companies that are generating terabytes worth of data around their sustainability have no means of processing it. They have nobody on site that has the skills to process that data or identify if that data is actually worthwhile. So they go external and they spend more money essentially. Next slide, please. So what are we doing? So for the AMRC Northwest perspective, we're a low carbon demonstrator. And that means when companies come in and we get footfall through the building, we are demonstrating technologies to those businesses that could potentially have a positive effect on their net zero or carbon neutral goals. So some of the systems we have cover factory ecosystem monitoring, which means we're looking at the use of the building. So are we using the building effectively? One of the key things that a lot of people did over COVID was everybody replaced all of their lights with LED bulbs, and they started implementing PIR sensors and kind of monitoring things that way. And while they are quick wins, they're going to reduce your energy bill overall. They still need to be used effectively. And you can monitor this via data. So, for example, occupancy data is a key one. I'm sat in this room now and the lights are on, and I can hear the air conditioning unit running. If somebody walks through this room, because this room has a PIR sensor, the lights will come on and the air conditioning will kick in. That costs money. It's as simple as that. So if we're using a building where we have high traffic thoroughfare areas where people aren't necessarily hanging around, do we need a PIR sensor in that room? Do we need automatic lights? Do we need LED? Or do we just want to go back to the standard thing of everybody's dad shouting at them about Blackpool illuminations and leaving lights on? It's not that hard to turn a light off. And we've kind of gotten lazy in the sense that PIR sensors solve one problem for us, but have started to introduce another. If you have PIR sensors and lights are on because someone's walked through that room, then somebody needs to have managed that and have it set so that every 10 seconds it checks again and turns them off. But in reality, a lot of businesses, the lights will be on for 15 minutes and then they'll go off. And it's bad for your carbon emissions, it's bad for your costs, it's wasting a lot of money. In a similar vein, again, please take this with a focus on a manufacturing environment. Air quality monitoring, while not initially considered sustainable. We use air quality monitoring in the purpose that, are we using our extraction systems too much? Are we overusing our extraction systems and our heating systems? So if we run our extraction systems at 100%, which a lot of manufacturers will to keep the air clean, are we overdoing it? So if we reduce our extraction systems down to 75%, and then the air is still clean and breathable, and we have no safety concerns around that, then you're reducing the overall use of your extraction systems by a quarter, and by association, reducing the cost to run those systems. And you can go as low as 50%. One of the key things that was done when Octopus Energy did the big Christmas switch off, or the big New Year switch off, a lot of businesses took part in that. The AMRC Wales actually took part in that without telling anybody, and the factory floor manager turned all of the lights down to 10% of their maximum brightness. Everybody came in after the new year and said, it's too dark in here, I'm not having this, and complained for 2 weeks. And then he turned the lights up by 15%, up to 25% brightness of the bulbs, down from 100%. And the AMRC Wales now save 5 figures a year in electrical costs and carbon emissions because of that. It's just shaking up the norm a little bit via data. Next slide, please. Renewable energy generation, obviously a consideration for everyone, but not necessarily the solution for everyone. A lot of companies nowadays have taken advantage of payment plans and reduced cost for solar panel implementation. Those same businesses are now considering things like battery energy storage. However, when you look at the operational periods for energy storage systems against the domestic and an industrial market, it's completely different. So when you consider a home market, all of your energy use is in the morning, and then you go to work. Throughout the day, your solar energy generation is massive because you're not using any energy at home. Then you come home in the evening, you eat your dinner, you go to bed. All of your energy use is between about 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. through to about 5 p.m. to 9 p.m., 10 p.m. Perfect for a battery storage solution. So in a domestic setting, you plonk your battery storage solution in the middle, and during the day when you're not at home and not using any energy, charges your batteries for you, and then you use them in the evening and in the morning. In an industrial setting, it's the complete opposite. No energy use in the morning, massive energy use using all of your solar or your renewable energy generation during the day, and then no energy use at night. But when you look at where battery storage is in that, it's not feasible. So companies need to consider these decisions, and work with companies like us to say, is it actually worthwhile for us? I realize I'm getting close on time here, so I'll just fire through some more of these. Next slide, please. Energy storage solutions, just gone over that. So this is a buzzword right now for a lot of businesses. A lot of businesses are saying we need energy storage, but the same businesses are running 2 shifts and operating for 24 hours a day. So there's no way that they're going to generate enough energy to actually store to make a difference, unless it's over the weekend and we get a very, very sunny day. But then really only 3 months out of the year are you seeing any benefit on that. And the cost of investment into these is potentially not worthwhile and may not have as big an effect on your carbon footprint as you imagine. Next slide, please. Occupancy and asset managing. I've just gone over this, but this is the idea of using a facility, using a building, an office space as efficiently as you can potentially use it. So do we need more computers, more desks, more lighting, more extraction systems, or do we need to use what we've got better? So our example for us is we're running out of meeting rooms, but that'll be over 2 days where someone has realized that they don't have space for a meeting. It's not necessarily the case that you need more meeting rooms. It's just that you need to schedule around that. Same for machine usage and machine allocation. Do we need a new machine, which is going to add to our electricity bill and add to our carbon footprint? Or do we just need to use what we've got more efficiently? And should we investigate that instead? Next slide. Equipment monitoring, again, just gone over this, but this is more about actually seeing how effectively you use your assets, not your building. So you can see the graph in the bottom right-hand corner there is an hourly consumption heat map. You can see at any time during the day, this piece of equipment is consuming power, it's consuming electricity. That will then be converted into an associated emissions number and an associated cost, and allow businesses to start to chip away at that and make informed decisions around it. Next slide, please. This is an example of the IoT architecture that we do to do equipment monitoring. So the idea behind this is off-the-shelf equipment that companies can start to integrate to start to generate information and data around their carbon emissions and their power usage. And it doesn't have to be intrusive. It doesn't have to be invasive. People don't need IoT or Internet of Things or digital skills to do this kind of thing. So it's really good for businesses to be able to do. Next slide. And this is an example of the data that you can produce. So we can see here that we had a compressor running for a day shift between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. We can see that that consumed 1,043 kilowatts of energy. And then against the tariff, which is a daytime tariff, we can see it cost them £309.36 to run that compressor. The kicker being that compressor does not need to run for the entire day. So they can reduce the cost and they can reduce the overall carbon footprint against this when considering carbon intensity on the grid. Next slide, please. Again, just more examples of data. So this is the idea behind this, is making this visual enough for people to be able to say, right, I can actually see what's going on. The old adage of when you have a dashboard or when you have a website, you should be able to get to where you need to go in 3 clicks. Anything more than that is excessive and considered not a great user experience. The idea behind this data is to be able to look at that and say, right, yellow is energy consumption. The darker it gets, we've got no energy consumption. An operations manager will take a look at that and say, right, we're overutilizing or we're being very, very process efficient. And then they can compare this data against capacity, throughput, and actually see if they're using their energy effectively. Next slide. Environmental monitoring, again, gone over this, but this is the idea of making sure that in specific industries, you're not polluting as much. So we talk a lot about carbon emissions, but when you consider biodiversity, if you have a downspout that's actually sending out polluted water or water that has particulate matter in it that could be potentially damaging or hazardous to the environment, that is also something that you should be reporting. Biodiversity and biodiversity credits are a massive aim towards some of your SDGs and also towards your reporting. So this is something that should be monitored and can be monitored relatively easy. But you'll find that across a lot of businesses, it isn't actually, it's kind of seen as a, we'll do it when we get to it, when in reality, this is something that should be done in the here and now. Next slide, please. And you can, I think you can skip the next one. The next one's a video, that's perfectly fine. And then waste tracking and management. So I think this is it. And then I've got a case study afterwards. This one's key, actually. So this one has a lot of legislature behind it now, especially around waste codes and where you can recycle certain waste. So there's a lot of software that allows you to do this as a business, but there's not a lot of knowledge around other choices. So a lot of companies nowadays, when you look at Costa Coffee, Sainsbury's, etc., they will typically use one waste carrier. They'll use someone like Biffa, and Biffa will collect all of their bins at the end of the day, and they'll do every run for them and every route. What you find, though, is it may be more carbon effective to actually use a number of providers that take your waste and separate it. So you may have a provider that takes food waste and recycles it more locally than Biffa might do with their mainstream supply chain. You may have a supplier that takes your wood or construction waste and actually has someone just down the road who will recycle that more effectively, potentially at a higher cost, but it will reduce your overall carbon footprint. The aim we've got with these kind of systems is to reduce that arc. So you can see on the map, on that image, there's a huge arc there, and that arc comes from our AMRC Wales site all the way down to Exeter. Now, that was one journey for one waste code, which was tanker sludge. Now, it may be the case that the place in Exeter is the only place in the country that can actually recycle this waste. However, it may also be the case that nobody investigated it properly, and actually there was someone within a 5-mile radius who could have taken that waste. They're just so used to using the same waste recycling and the same waste provider that this becomes an autopilot thing. So these systems are the idea of breaking the norm and saying, no, actually, rather than just going with the known, we're going to start considering the unknown and start considering offsetting our waste travel and our waste journey. Because when your waste is picked up, that's still your product. And as that waste is being taken to a recycling center, all of the transport CO2e and then the process CO2e of that product is your scope 3. Only once that material has been processed does it become your waste recycler's scope 1 and scope 3 emissions. So you have to consider it right up until death of part. Next slide, please. Again, this was just, it's the same slide, but this is more around once you know what your waste recycling or your waste transport emissions are, you can start to offset them. So you can say we recycle all of our waste, and actually the process of actually recycling that waste is completely carbon neutral. It's a quick win. It's relatively easy to do, and most businesses should be starting to consider this. And then next slide. So what we can do here is if you just skip through to there should be a slide with a quote on it. So that's that one. So this is the last slide from me. This is an example of, we got approached by Hikuro. They're a specialist service provider into the aerospace industry. They're part of a large group across Europe. And their big thing was they got pushed from above. Everybody within the group is starting to move towards these carbon neutral goals, operational carbon. What are we going to do about it? They approached us. We installed about £100 worth of IoT equipment and sensors. And those sensors identified a cost saving of somewhere, I think it was somewhere, it will have been around about £5,000 to £6,000 per machine per annum. And this is a big place. So this was around monitoring their operational effectiveness. And these guys have actually since moved on now to start to monitor pollutants in their chemical baths, energy usage, energy efficiency around new machines and new products that are coming in. And it brought forward their aim for carbon neutrality, because they are now aware of what they can do. And they set their goals based on operational efficiencies. You know, that can actually bring those goals forward, and they could probably achieve them all. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, James. Thank you for some excellent examples there, some real practical guidance, and also a big thank you to Claire for taking us through some more of the legal issues. Before we leave you to your afternoons, did anybody have any questions? No, that's fine. If there is anything that occurs to you, please don't hesitate to let us know. Contact any of us. We will circulate, as I say, a copy of this talk to you. So if there are any issues you want to explore in more depth, you know, after you've had a look, please do get in touch. So I think that all that remains really is for me to thank you for joining us again. What I hope's been a very informative and detailed run through what is a big topic, and a topic that's going to be even more important as time goes on. So thank you for joining Nathans. Thank you for joining AMRC. We hope to be having further talks in the future, and we look forward to your joining us again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, James.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.